The truth doesn't care about our needs or wants, doesn't care about our governments or our ideologies or our religions. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. June 18th, 1987. This journal was given to me by one of my friends a while ago, and I didn't get a chance to write in it until now. I've tried to make entries as often as I can. To begin, my name is Nikolai Smirnov. I'm a sergeant in the Spetsnaz, or Soviet Special Forces, though my specific unit is classified. If I were to write too much in this journal and it was discovered, I have no doubts that I would be severely punished. I can't say much of my previous missions because they too are also classified, but our missions are mostly abroad in places like the Middle East and Central Europe. Currently we are stationed in northern Ukraine, though that is likely going to change soon. As I sit in my cot writing this, the rest of the soldiers in our company are packing up and preparing for redeployment. Although the higher ranks have seemed quite agitated for the past few days, the rest of us are still in the dark as to where we're going. My friend Roman says he's heard we're going to be briefed on the nature of our mission tomorrow. I'm going to have to stop here. Someone's calling me. June 19th, 1987. Early this morning, we finally finished packing everything, and our convoy began traveling west. Towards the end of the day, we stopped and made camp for the night. We were told that our destination was only an hour away, and we would set off first thing in the morning. We were also told where we were going and why. Tomorrow, we will be in Pripyat, and then we will head on to our final destination, the ruins of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They say that our mission is to recover important documents that, in the haste to evacuate, were left behind by scientists at the plant. Once it started to get dark, we set up our tents and started some campfires. The fact that we're going to Chernobyl certainly explains why we haven't stopped at any sort of town to rest instead of camping out in the wilderness. Anton was complaining as we set up our tents that it seems ridiculous that they needed this many men to retrieve classified information within our own borders. How important are those damn papers? I can't think of any that would be worth sending an entire company to retrieve, special forces at that. This hadn't occurred to me. Now that I think about it, it does seem rather odd. It certainly doesn't seem like this many men would be needed, loaded with so much combat equipment, simply to retrieve some documents. At any rate, that's probably not the full story, but it's not likely that we'll be told anything else. Besides, in the Soviet Union, asking the wrong questions can land you in a world of trouble. Leonid, our squad leader, overheard Anton's complaining and replied, "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. Now, get the rest of these tents set up." I guess even though it seems odd, Chernobyl itself is certainly odd. After the meltdown of the nuclear plant, the plant and the area of land hundreds of miles wide was evacuated. Checkpoints were set up around the newly irradiated land to prevent anyone from going back in. After the tents had been set up, the rest of my squad and I sat around the fire and talked for a while before turning in for the night. I suppose now is as good a time as any to introduce the members of my squad. Leonid, a tall, imposing man with cunning to spare, is our leader and the lieutenant. There's also Roman, tall, lanky, and piercing green eyes. He's my closest friend of the bunch. Then there's Yuri, who has fiery red hair but he covers up with a cap or a helmet whenever he can. Terrible camouflage, he says. Anton, a short, stocky fellow who's often too outspoken for his own good. Mikhail, quiet, soft-spoken rookie who was only recently assigned to our squad. And myself. I would talk about them more, but I think it's going to have to do for this evening. I'm getting tired. Almost everyone else is already asleep. June 20th, 1987. Early this morning we packed up and set out for Pripyat, passing through several checkpoints on the way. As we made our way through the checkpoints, each more heavily guarded than the last, I was surprised at the speed at which we were allowed to pass through. Roman, Mikhail, and I all expected getting through the security forces around Chernobyl to take out most of the morning, especially since we made a point of avoiding any people on the way here and hadn't even been told where we were going until we were almost there already. Clearly there's more going on than we're being told, but we act as if we don't know that, since the secret police are far deadlier than any dangers I've ever faced. When we got to the last checkpoint, before we could continue into Pripyat, we were outfitted with heavy radiation protection suits, gas masks, and a bottle of anti-radiation pills each to keep ourselves safe from radiation exposure. As we suited up, I overheard one of the guards who was bringing us the equipment complaining to his comrade, saying something about how, at the rate we were coming, they would run out of supplies for themselves. I waited for his friends to leave, and I stopped him. When I explained how I'd overheard him talking and asked what he meant, he jumped and turned to face me, eyeing me suspiciously. He looked awful. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked as if he hadn't slept in days. He turned to make sure that nobody else was listening. Then he pulled me off to the side, out of the earshot of anyone else. He said, "You're not the first group to come through here, you know. In fact, you're the fifth in the last 2 months. Yours is definitely the largest so far, though." Puzzled, I asked him, "Did any of them tell you why they came?" After all, they could have been research teams studying the effect of the Chernobyl radiation. After a disaster of this size, it would be important to know what effects the radiation would have on the surrounding wildlife and people who were nearby. He sighed and then said, "Let me guess. You're here to get data that the scientists left behind because of the evacuation. Important, classified, blah, blah, blah." "Then that's what they were here for, too?" I asked, surprised. He nodded grimly. "And let me tell you something else. Of all 4 groups that came before you, none of them ever came back out." Before I could say anything else, he turned and headed back towards the guardhouse. "Take care of yourself, comrade," he called over his shoulder. Suddenly, Roman walked up behind me. "You ready to go?" he asked. Yeah, I think so," I replied. "What were you talking to that guy about? You look like you'd seen a ghost," he said, frowning. I started, then noticed Leonid staring at me. I wasn't sure if he could hear us, but I decided it wasn't worth the risk. "I'll tell you later," I said. "I think we're moving out anyway." Right on cue, the truck's engine started up again, and soldiers started climbing in the backs. Later that morning, we arrived at the outskirts of Pripyat and paused briefly before driving deeper into the abandoned city. The whole ride was absolutely surreal. As I sat in the back of one of the trucks, looking out of the back, I marveled at the way nature had already begun to reclaim the city. The utter silence, aside from the sound of the trucks making their way through the desolate streets, was unnerving. I looked back to the inside of the truck at my squad mates. Roman was asleep, as were Yuri and Anton. Mikhail was staring out at the skyline of Pripyat, fixated on the crumbling buildings surrounding us. Leonid just sat there with an expression of indifference. I wonder if he heard that guard at the checkpoint talking to me. I really hope he didn't. We'd both be in trouble, the guard for revealing sensitive information, and me for not reporting him. June 23rd, 1987. A lot has happened since my last entry. We made it to the heart of Pripyat and set up a more permanent base camp where we'll stay until our mission is accomplished. Tents were set up in an intersection clear of abandoned cars, but others, mostly officers, took up residence in some of the more intact buildings. Some of us were tasked with clearing out the building to make them livable, myself included. It took a long time, and by the time we were done, The sun was already starting to set. Cleaning out the buildings was more depressing than anything else, really. It was sad to think of all those people that were forced to leave with whatever they could carry, thinking they'd be gone for a few days at most. Of course, that wasn't the case. I could go on and on about all the things we found. Photos of loved ones, children's toys, that sort of thing. But, well, that isn't the worst of it. It's got me thinking. The nuclear meltdown did this much damage. I can't imagine the destruction a nuclear war with the Americans could cause. I don't think I ever really thought about that before. There's something else. The further we've gotten into Chernobyl, the more uneasy I felt. Not just because of the atmosphere of this place, but something else. I feel like we're being watched. Nothing bad has happened to us, of course, but something feels off. I do know that there's almost certainly more to this mission than we're being told. What that is, I don't know. I hope it doesn't have anything to do with what that guard told me, and that, well, he was just messing with me. I guess we'll have to see. Nothing much else has happened. Roman, Yuri, and myself played cards all afternoon, while Leonid was meeting with the other officers in the apartment complex they're using as a command center. I haven't seen Mikhail all day, though. When we woke up, his cot was empty and his boots and rifle were gone. Well, I'm about to turn in for the night, and he still hasn't come back. I think I'll ask Leonid about it in the morning. June 25th, 1987. It's been 2 days, and we still haven't found Mikhail. When I told Leonid about it in the morning, he had us and another squad search the camp for him. There's no sign of him anywhere. Yesterday they started sending out patrols every hour, each going further away from the camp in hopes of finding him. So far, they found nothing. I can't imagine why he would wander off, or how he could have gotten lost. The commander says he'll give it another day, and then he's giving up. He says we need those patrols out looking for a safe way through the pockets of high radiation surrounding the plant. That's what's kept us from getting this mission done and getting out of here. Apparently, the higher-ups didn't think that the radiation around the plant would be in concentrated pockets. Well, so much so that a couple of meters could be the difference between an irradiated suit and dying 30 days later from radiation poisoning. This mission is going to take a lot longer than we thought. June 26th, 1987. Things around here have taken a turn for the worse. One of the patrols that was sent out vanished. When they didn't come back to base on time, another 5-man patrol was sent out to look for them. Of those 5 men that were sent out to look, only 2 came back. An hour after they left, they were spotted a block away, running back towards the camp. Both were visibly shaken, and one of them was crying. When one of the officers asked them where the rest of their squad was, the man who was crying just sobbed even harder, and his friend just stood there with a horrified expression on his face, not saying a word. Neither of them would talk. This in itself was to put the whole camp on edge, and it only got worse when both of them committed suicide soon after. The crying man was the only one who ever spoke with anyone, and the only thing that they were able to get out of him was that everyone else in his squad was dead. When they tried to get him to tell them how they'd been killed, he fell silent, started to say something, and stood up with his pistol and walked out of the tent. They followed him out and found him sprawled on the ground with a bullet in the side of his head. I don't know what's going on, but what I do know is that there's something out there that horrified those men so much that they took their own lives because of it. I can only hope that my squad and I will fare better. When Leonid's not around, Anton has talked about deserting. I don't know what the hell is going on here, but I don't like it. I'd take one of these trucks and get out while I still could, if it weren't for the security around this place. They'd never let any of us leave this place alive once they found out that we ran off. Yuri nodded. That's the problem, isn't it? We're stuck here until we finish this mission, or everything goes to hell. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm sure there's a whole lot more to it than they're telling us. No one spoke for a while. Finally, Roman broke the silence. Well, I'm going to get some sleep. I have a feeling we're not going to get rest for a while. Everyone mumbled agreement and shuffled off to their cots. Roman's right. I think this is the last good night's sleep anyone here is going to get for a while. June 28th, 1987. This is going to be a long entry. My hands are still shaking as I write this. I think it's morning, but I can't know for sure. The floor we're in has its windows boarded up, and we already barricaded the doors. Everyone's nerves are shot, and our rations are probably going to run out soon. Okay, let me start at the beginning. Everything went to hell sometime around noon of yesterday. That morning we finally got underway and began the trip to the plant at around 0600, with about half of us staying at the camp. It was cloudy, with dark storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The rest of us got our gear together and climbed into the convoy of trucks and armored personnel carriers, waiting for us outside the camp. The first half of the ride was relatively uneventful. My squad rode in one of the APCs this time, one of the new models, a BTR-80. It was buttoned up, so we had no view of the outside world as the 8-wheeled behemoth rumbled through the abandoned streets. There was plenty of chatter on the radio, mostly just idle talk between vehicles. But inside ours, aside from the driver talking into his headset, there was only an awkward silence. Later on, it started to rain, and Leonid had Anton close the top hatch. We heard the tapping of raindrops on the roof of the BTR become louder as the rain got heavier and heavier. After about a half hour, at least I think it was a half hour, I shifted uncomfortably in my seat and turned to Roman in an attempt to break the silence. Before I could even open my mouth, Leonid tensed up suddenly. I thought he was going to say something, but when I looked at him, he was listening intently to his radio. It started out soft, and I strained to listen to whatever the person on the other end was saying. Whatever they were saying, it was mostly lost in the shouts in the background. I wondered what the commotion was about, and was about to ask when the words on the other end were drowned out in a burst of gunfire. Everyone in the vehicle turned towards the radio. On the radio, the sound of gunfire was becoming more intense, and the voice yelled to someone in the background. "Get the officers inside, and put snipers on the rooftops. They must not breach the perimeter." We turned to each other, our eyes wide. My mind raced. Who was attacking the camp? My first thought it was NATO or the Americans, but that seemed unlikely. My next thought was that it might be feral wildlife. It would have to be a fairly large group, perhaps a pack of feral dogs, to cause such a commotion. My thoughts were interrupted by the sudden worried talk between the rest of my squad. "Quiet!" roared Leonid. We turned to him in surprise. Leonid was by no means friendly, but he was usually unemotional and distant, using intimidation alone to get his way. Now he seemed worried and angry. I could hear it in his voice. Whatever was going on, it was serious. At some point during all of this, the BTR must have stopped. "What's the hold-up?" complained the driver, looking at the vehicle stopped in front of us. "Might be an old bus blocking the road or something," offered Yuri distractedly. The driver frowned. "This way is supposed to be clear," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't..." Suddenly we all heard a loud crack of thunder, followed by a long rumbling and vibrations we could feel through the floor of the BTR. This lasted maybe 5 seconds before it abruptly stopped, and we were left with nothing but the sound of the rain. The driver listened to his headset for a couple of minutes intently before turning to us. A building up ahead got hit by lightning. Apparently it set off propane tanks inside and brought part of it down. It's blocking the road, so we're waiting until the storm lets up to clear it. Anton groaned. "You mean we're stuck here?" The driver nodded. "This is the only way that's not full of radioactive hotspots that we could find. We're just going to have to wait it out." I turned to Leonid, expecting him to say something to Anton, but he was still listening to the radio. I'd almost forgotten about it. Now, as I strained to hear what he was listening to, I could only hear static. I leaned closer, just as the static cut out and the sounds of gunfire filled the vehicle. Everyone in the squad turned back to Leonid. He was too focused on the radio to pay attention to us, and I took a good look at him. He looked slightly pale. He was frowning and muttering to himself. I couldn't tell what he was saying, though. Roman nudged me and jolted me out of my thoughts. "Do you hear that?" he half whispered to me, his eyes wide. I nodded uneasily. "I'm sure they're fine. The gunfire is much less intense now. Sounds like they're just cleaning house." Roman shook his head. "Not that," he said. I listened closely, and with a chill, I realized that, mixed in with the gunfire that lessened with each passing minute, I could hear screaming. "I can't write more now. I can hear them coming." June 29th, 1987. Nothing much has changed since the last entry. We got through the day without incident, but if we can't find a way out of this place, it's only a matter of time until we're discovered and overrun. Since today was mostly uneventful, I'll pick up from where I left off yesterday. For a while, nothing really happened. The gunfire gradually faded away, and the screams died out shortly after. Leonid took a deep, shaky breath and switched the radio off. The storm was still going strong, and for a long time no one said a word. Then Anton spoke up. "So, what in the hell was that?" Leonid regained some of his composure and said, "I don't know, but I'm sure we'll find out when we get back to camp. We're not going back until we get the intel we need from the plant." "Bullshit," snarled Anton. "I don't think you're high up enough to know everything, but you know something, and whatever it is, it could get all of us killed." Anton was going too far. Privately, I agreed with him, but he wasn't going to accomplish anything except make Leonid angry. Leonid glared at Anton. "You risk death on a regular basis. This isn't any different. Now, if you know what's good for you, you'll shut up and stop asking stupid questions," he replied coldly. "The hell it isn't," yelled Anton. "We don't even know what we're up against." I opened my mouth to tell Anton to calm down before he got into serious trouble. But before I could, Leonid whirled around to face me. "Don't you dare say a word," he hissed. "I know all about your little talk back at the checkpoint. If you don't want to end up like he did, you'll keep your mouth shut." My heart jumped, and I fought down a surge of panic. He had heard us after all. I thought about asking what had happened to the guard, but deep down, I think I already knew the answer. Everyone else turned to me curiously, but thankfully they were distracted by Anton as he started yelling at Leonid again. He kept at it, and Yuri, Roman, and I watched, not saying anything. The driver was too focused on the talk between the rest of the vehicles in the convoy to pay attention to the screaming match in the back, and he did his best to ignore us. They argued back and forth for what seemed like hours, until Leonid yelled, "Shut up!" Anton growled, "Make me, you son of a..." Leonid slipped his submachine gun off his shoulder, and Anton slammed his mouth shut. Nobody moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked past Anton and looked up the hatch. "Listen," he hissed. We all listened, and now I realized that, mixed in with the sounds of the storm, I could hear shouting and bursts of gunfire. Leonid reached for the latch, but before he could open the hatch, the driver spoke up. "Sir, orders from Captain Petrov. All personnel are to stay inside their vehicles. ACPs, stay buttoned up and don't let anyone in, no matter what. Sit it out until he gives the all clear." Leonid wavered at the hatch, then walked back to his seat. Anton burst out. "See? We..." Leonid cut him off. Once we're given the all clear, I'll tell you what I know. If I hear one more word from you before then, I'll shoot your kneecaps off." Anton opened his mouth to protest, and Leonid flicked the safety off of his gun. Anton nodded and took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. For a while, the gunfire and shouts only got louder, though we couldn't hear them over the storm. Over time, the bursts of gunfire dwindled and became increasingly sporadic. The shouting gradually grew more panicked in tone and was mixed with piercing screams. At one point, we could feel someone pull themselves onto the top of the BTR and start banging on the hatch, screaming and begging for us to let them in. None of us moved, partially out of fear of Leonid, and partially for fear of whatever was outside. The screams from above were cut off abruptly with a wet thud, and something slid off the roof and hit the pavement. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds outside stopped, and the storm let up. It sounded like the torrent of rain had turned into a light drizzle, and the thunder had almost completely stopped. By this point, everyone was on edge. I felt relief wash over me as the driver turned and said, "All clear. Proceed with caution." Leonid strode to the hatch with his gun in hand and opened the top. He peered outside tentatively before climbing up the ladder, stopping when his whole upper body was outside the hatch. Anton started to get up, but Yuri yanked him down into his seat. "Are you crazy? Wait until he's ready to tell us. Are you trying to get shot?" Anton muttered. "He said he'd say after they gave the all clear. He better not try and go back on the promise." "And what will you do if he does? Beat it out of him? If he doesn't want to tell us anything, we can't make him," whispered Roman. I nodded. "We want to know what's going on too, but if you can't keep your mouth shut, you'll never tell us anything." Anton glared at me. "And what do you plan to do? March to your death like a good little soldier? Do you think whatever's out there won't come after us if we're on our best behavior?" Roman countered. "You'll get killed a lot quicker if Leonid hears you." Anton snorted. "Oh, please. He's still standing outside the hatch, not eavesdropping on us." I turned to Leonid. He was still perched on the ladder, with only his waist and legs visible. While the others continued to argue in whispers, I got up and walked over to Leonid. "Sir, what's going on up there?" I asked. I waited. No response. I tried again. "Sir, what's the matter?" I asked. Still nothing. I nudged him, trying to get his attention. Instead, his foot slipped off the rung, and he tumbled down face first onto the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned down and turned him over. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." And then I stopped. Leonid was dead. His gas mask was gone, and what was left on his chewed and gouged head was no longer a face. A lot of what happened after was a blur. We searched the line of vehicles in the convoy. The troops in the BTRs were protected well enough, but the men in the trucks weren't so lucky. The cloth covering the backs of the trucks was torn to shreds, and their occupants had been horribly mutilated. Shell cases were scattered all over the place, but few traces of whatever had attacked. All we found were puddles of a viscous, pale green substance. No bodies except for those of our men. At least, what was left of them, were ever found. Some of the bodies were missing arms and legs. Others had been decapitated. Once we counted the dead, we realized some of the men had disappeared entirely. I was surprised nobody deserted on the spot when we were told we were proceeding with the mission. But then, it wasn't like we had a choice. Even if we weren't shot for treason, where would we go? None of us really know what was killing off our comrades. The officers are keeping silent, and anyone who saw anything that day didn't live to talk about it. Only Leonid was able to tell us anything, and those secrets died with him. I was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of my squad in place of Leonid. We used the BTR's main guns to blast away the rubble blocking the road, but by this time the sun had set. After gathering all the equipment we could carry, we loaded it onto the 3 BTRs in the best condition and drove until we were within sight of the power plant. Everyone unpacked and holed up in one of the abandoned buildings. We chose one with 3 stories and set up camp on the second and third. We parked each BTR on a different side of the building in case we needed to make a run for it. We did a quick head count. We're down to 29 men now. And after we set watchmen, most of us were fast asleep. When we woke up, well, that's when I started writing the entry before this one. Not one of us has left this place since. The men can hear something, perhaps several somethings, moving around downstairs. Hopefully, whatever it is will give up and go away so we can get this mission done and get out of this godforsaken hellscape. Well, I guess we'll see what tomorrow brings. June 30th, 1987. We made a break for it today. The men pried the boards from the second floor windows and everyone got their gear together. Captain Petrov split us up into 3 groups. Our group was my squad, our driver Sergei, and another squad that was also down to 4 men. On Petrov's signal, all 3 groups rappelled down at once. As soon as we hit the ground, it was a mad dash for the BTRs. Everyone in our group made it inside and locked the hatches behind them. Sergei hurried to his seat and started the engine. He turned onto the road and fell in line between the 2 other APCs. After about 15 minutes, the captain's voice crackled on the radio. Sound off. BTR-1 secure. Sergei leaned forward, saying, BTR-2 secure. Another voice, which I assume was the driver of the 3rd BTR, said, We've got everyone, but... Another voice in the background yelled, Hold him down! Followed by the sounds of a scuffle and muffled shouting. The driver continued. There was a feral dog, I think. It attacked one of the men. It must have had rabies or something because... Another man's voice interrupted. This isn't rabies. Rabies doesn't do this to people. Followed by a loud thud and a howl of pain. Get him off me! Get him off! Someone screamed. A violent struggle could be heard, followed by a pair of gunshots. BTR-3, what is your status? Captain Petrov asked. There was a moment of silence. Then the driver spoke, his voice shaking. BTR-3, secure. 2 men KIA. The captain didn't miss a beat. Dispose of the bodies. I don't want anyone else contracting whatever that dog had. Yes, sir, the driver replied. Not long after, we finally reached the plant. The fence, topped with barbed wire and covered with signs promising a painful death to anyone who tried to enter without authorization, was crushed underneath the BTR's massive wheels. We drove up to one of the entrances, parking along the cooling pond that had once supplied the plant with water to cool the reactors. Everyone piled out, including 2 of the drivers, who looked less than happy at the prospect of being out in the open again. Captain Petrov paced back and forth in front of us, seemingly lost in thought. All right, he said, turning to us. I want the perimeter secure before sundown, split up by squad. He paused, then added, and no one is to enter any of the buildings unless I order you to. Let's get moving. Despite the apprehension everyone felt, it soon became clear that this was probably the safest place to be. Although it was the heart of the exclusion zone, the site was devoid of wildlife, and the fences ensured nothing could wander in. Our patrol was mostly uneventful. I had orders from my squad to repair the fence, but the poles had been snapped off where they were buried in the concrete. All of us spread out and looked for something to block it instead. Sergei found a truck that still had gas and found the keys in the ignition. He started the engine, put the truck in reverse, and promptly crashed into a guardhouse, crushing the flimsy wood structure and puncturing one of the tires. The rest of us were shaking with laughter. As an annoyed and red-faced Sergei backed the truck into the gap in the fence, it occurred to me I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed, or even felt particularly cheerful. Should have known it was too good to last. We trooped back to where we'd parked, found the rest of the men already there. All of them seemed distracted. Once I got closer, I could see why. The third BTR and its driver had vanished. Petrov was furious. He ordered a sweep of the compound, but we found nothing. Nobody really expected to, either. He's a coward, but not stupid enough to hang around after deserting. Some of the men broke into the plant and set up camp in some of the rooms. The rest, including myself, are crammed into the last 2 BTRs. This mission just keeps getting better and better. July 1st, 1987. At long last, we finally got into the plant. Everyone went in with us this time, so nobody could run off. The plant was normal enough at first, and as we got further inside, we used the lights on our guns. Well, not everyone. Roman and 3 others had flamethrowers that someone had found stashed in the back of one of the BTRs. Rather than have us fan out and search the plant, Petrov led the way deeper and deeper into the complex, everyone trailing behind it. He clearly knew exactly where we were going. Eventually we came to a halt in front of a massive elevator. Surprisingly, when you pressed the button, the door slid open. Then they shuddered and stopped. It took 6 of us just to force one of the doors all the way open. We all piled in, and Petrov pressed the button for sub-basement 4, which was the lowest floor available. The doors slid shut. Roman muttered, "The hell did they need this big of an elevator for?" "Heavy machinery, maybe," I replied. Roman shrugged. "Could be. Whatever it was, I'll bet it's above our pay grade." Just then the elevator came to a shuddering halt and the doors opened. We trooped out and emerged in a long corridor that, in the darkness, seemed to stretch on forever. My gun's light caught something on the wall next to me. I walked over to it and saw that it was a switch labeled Emergency Power. I pulled it down and, to my surprise, the lights flickered and turned on. Petrov turned to me and nodded in approval. "Good find, Nikolai. They must have installed a backup generator." Everyone turned off their flashlights. He turned to address the whole group. "Anything you encounter down here is extremely classified. If you so much as breathe a word of it to anyone, you will be disciplined." Everyone knew what that meant. "In each of the rooms, you will ensure its contents are secure. Do not, under any circumstances, enter any of the rooms unless told to do so." As we marched down the hall, Anton said, under his breath, "What the hell is going on in this place?" Yuri sighed. "At this point, I don't think anything would surprise me." We came upon sets of heavy steel doors that ran along the sides of the hallway, each with a viewing slot that slid open to reveal the contents of the room beyond. At Petrov's orders, each man went to a door. I stood next to one of the men as he slid the viewing slot on the first door open. I saw his eyes widen in shock before a long, whip-like appendage lashed out and punched through his visor. Blood spattered all over the floor and walls, and he was pulled forward and slammed against the door. He yelled and struggled, but couldn't pull himself away. Roman shoved past me and jammed the nozzle of the flamethrower into the slot in the door. He pulled the trigger, and a piercing, eerie shriek came from the room before abruptly falling silent. The man's face was released, and he slumped to the floor. Cautiously, I peered through the slit. The room was made of concrete, and was empty save for the smoking, charred remains of something that, while burned beyond recognition, had clearly not been human. I slid the viewing slot shut and turned to see Roman examining the unfortunate soldier. He shook his head. "He's dead." I looked and almost threw up. He was a mess. The visor had shattered, with fragments embedding in his face. He had both eyes gouged out, and his face and neck were covered in bruises and puncture wounds. The whole hall was silent for a moment. Then Petrov spoke up. Look from the side of the slot, not directly in front of it. Have someone cover you when you open the slot. Anton looked mutinous. That's all he's going to say, he snarled under his breath. I shot him a warning look, and he shut up. Slowly, numbly, the rest of the men turned to the doors. I grabbed the viewing slot on the next door and looked to Roman, who had his gun trained on the door. He nodded, and I slowly opened the slot. Roman squinted at the opening in confusion. It's empty, he said. I glanced through the slot and saw he was right. The room was bare, except for hundreds of scratches that looked suspiciously like claw marks. I tried to tell Petrov, but suddenly my voice was drowned out by a cacophony of screeches and wails from the rooms around us as the creatures inside were burned alive. When the awful noise had died down, everyone moved on to doors further down the hall. I told Petrov about the room. He scowled and peered through the slots. All right, take your squad and clear the room. And be careful. I nodded and called Anton and Yuri over. Roman and Yuri and I trained our guns on the door as Anton placed a small, explosive charge on the latch. He backed away and, on the count of 3, pressed the detonator. Bits of concrete went everywhere, and Anton slammed into the door twice. 3 times, before the door swung inward and his momentum carried him into the center of the room. He regained his balance and scanned the corners. Nothing here, declared, looking relieved. Just then, something dropped from the ceiling and landed squarely on top of him. I charged into the room and body-slammed the thing, knocking it into the wall. I looked up to see a man, at least something that had at one point been a man, scramble halfway up the wall before turning his head a full 180 degrees to look at me. It hissed, revealing a mouth filled with uneven, yellow teeth as sharp as knives. It scrambled up the wall and across the ceiling before dropping down into the hallway, flexing fingers that sported short, curved claws. Oh, no, you don't, roared Yuri, throwing himself at the creature and pinning it to the ground. I raised my gun, but Anton beat me to it, pulling himself up and putting a bullet in the thing's forehead. Its whole body stiffened, twitched once, and was still. A luminous yellow fluid seeped from the wound. Oh, Jesus, said Yuri as he pulled himself off of the body. I leaned closer and felt sick to my stomach. The flesh on the fingers and toes had been worn away to the bone, which had been honed into points. It was wearing a tattooed orange jumpsuit that was stained with blood. Behind me, I heard a dull thud and turned to see Anton sprawled on the floor. Oh, I landed on my leg funny, he said, wincing as he tried to get up. All right, take it easy, I'll get a medic, I replied, stepping over the body of the creature and out into the hall. Most of the rooms were clear, and most soldiers were just standing around awkwardly while the last few rooms were taken care of. I found a medic, and soon Anton had his leg in a splint and hobbled out of the room, using his rifle as a crutch. Petrov spotted him and jogged over. Frowning, he asked, "Did something go wrong?" "No, sir," said Anton sarcastically. "This is exactly where I wanted to end up." I felt a strong urge to slap him, but at the same time I couldn't help but smile. "Don't worry, sir," I said. "When he stops being a smartass, that's when you'll know he's really hurt." "Might be an improvement," said Petrov, scowling at Anton. At that moment, a man whom I recognized as one of the drivers walked up behind Petrov and tapped him on the shoulder. "Sir, all the rooms are clear except the last one. The viewing slot is welded shut, so we've got no idea what's in there." Petrov thought for a moment before replying. "All right, round everyone up. Let's get this over with." He said something else after that, but I don't know what. I was too distracted to notice. I'd forgotten something, but what? I tried to remember. As we gathered on both sides of the final door, I was still desperately trying to remember. I was jarred back to reality as the door was blasted out of its frame and fell forward onto the floor with a dull thud. The squad backed away from the wall and positioned ourselves in the entrance, guns raised. As the dust settled, I felt my stomach drop. Beyond the doorframe wasn't another room, but a set of stairs that descended into darkness. The lights that lined the stairs were on, but extremely dim. Petrov glanced down the stairs before turning to us. "Nikolai, your squad's got sentry duty. Make sure nothing gets up these stairs. And definitely don't go down there yourselves. The rest of you, come with me to the ground floor. We'll sweep the plant for any sensitive information." After everyone else was in the elevator, Anton sat down in the hall with machine gun on his lap, eyeing the stairs warily. The rest of us stayed where we were, squinting down the stairway into the inky darkness. After an hour or so, we were all much more relaxed. Anton had fallen asleep, and the rest of us sat talking idly, glancing at the stairs every so often to make sure nothing snuck up on us. I took my Geiger counter off my belt and scanned the hall. The readout was 850 MSV. Not healthy by any means, but certainly not fatal. I aimed it at the stairs and it jumped to 1100 MSV. Still not fatal, but if it was high at the entrance, it would probably get higher as one went down. Shouldn't the dosage be higher up here? "I'm not complaining, but it's definitely weird," said Yuri as he peered over my shoulder. I shrugged. Nothing good, that's for sure. A few hours later, Petrov and the rest of the men returned. It was almost midnight, and another squad took our place on sentry duty. That left my squad and 3 others, so we each took a different room. "Say hello to your friend, Anton," I said as I dragged the corpse of the creature from earlier out of the room. Roman laughed. "Very funny," snapped Anton as he crawled into his sleeping bag. I walked back into the room and closed the steel door behind me, leaning Roman's flamethrower against it. At the very least, if something got into the room, it would wake us up. Later, as I curled up in my sleeping bag, I remembered earlier. I'd thought that I was missing something, but what? "Oh, I can wait," I thought to myself as I started to doze off. Whatever the driver reminded me of couldn't be that important. And then it hit me. I sat up, scrambled to my feet, and shook Roman awake. "What is it?" he said groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Where's Sergei?" I asked. "Wasn't he with us?" Roman's eyes widened. "Yeah, he was, come to think of it. I haven't seen him since yesterday, but he couldn't have run off." We checked with the other squads, but we couldn't find him. None of them had seen him either. Whatever's happened to him, I don't think he's coming back. And I don't think I'll be getting much sleep tonight. July 2nd, 1987. Screw it. Screw the whole mission. We're getting the hell out of here while we still can. This morning, Roman shook me awake. He looked as scared as I'd ever seen him. "They're gone," he whispered. "They're all fucking gone." "What?" I muttered, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. He shushed me. "Quiet. I'm going to wake the others. With any luck, whatever's downstairs won't notice." Head spinning, I rolled up my sleeping bag, slipped on my backpack, and grabbed my gun. Roman and I covered the door while Anton and Yuri packed up their gear. "What do you mean everyone's gone?" I whispered to Roman. "Listen," he whispered. Yuri joined us at the door, and Anton hobbled over and leaned against the wall. We all stood still and listened. Nothing. It was quiet as the grave. "I don't hear anything," said Anton finally. "That's just it," muttered Roman. "Maybe they're still asleep," Yuri said, hopefully. I glanced at my watch and my heart skipped a beat. It was nearly midday. Something was horribly wrong. I don't think so, I said. Keep your voice down, Roman whispered. I nodded. I opened the door and crept into the hall. It was deadly quiet. Let's check the other rooms, I whispered as I edged down the hall, the others close behind me. We searched the rest of the rooms, but there was no one. Sleeping bags, backpacks, and other gear were strewn around in the rooms where the other squads had been. Well, I think we'll have to check downstairs, I whispered. We flicked on our tactical lights and edged towards the stairs. Now, I wouldn't want to question orders, but wouldn't it be better to go away from the dark, foreboding stairway? Muttered Anton. I ignored him and began walking down the stairs. Why didn't they come after us? Whispered Yuri. I shrugged. Ours was the furthest room from the stairs, but, well, I really don't know. We finally reached the bottom of the stairs. I swung my light around. We were in what looked like a kind of control room, with monitors, surveillance equipment, and chairs lining the walls. At the end of the room was another, even heavier metal door, which stood open. I walked to the doorway and was half across the room when I stopped. A limp form was huddled in the door, leaning against it. I took another step and heard clattering at my feet. I turned my light to the floor and saw a few shell casings at my feet. My heart pounding, I quickly scanned the floor and saw bloodstains and more shell casings. Oh, shit, whispered Yuri. As I looked round, I could see that the floor was almost literally carpeted with shell casings and blood. Every so often, my light would catch the outline of chunks of flesh and bodies, some human, some that were likely human or animal in origin. Their bodies were oozing a viscous green fluid. I gingerly stepped over a gun with a severed hand still clutching the grip and looked up at the door. I shone my light on the body in the doorway. It was Petrov. His gas mask lay at his feet, the straps torn off. His suit was torn to shreds and one of his legs had been severed below the knee. We gathered at the door. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. All right, I whispered. Keep moving. Stay quiet. And... Without warning, Petrov shuddered, then jerkily pulled himself into a sitting position. We all jumped back. I leaned down. Sir, I whispered before trailing off and falling silent. His eyes shone on the light from our guns. Not white, but a sickening yellow-green and devoid of pupils. He lunged at me, letting out a guttural howl. I swung the butt of my rifle and hit him square in the face. His head snapped back, and Yuri emptied a full clip into the thing that had been Petrov. He fell backwards into the floor, shrieking and convulsing. Roman swept a jet of flame over him, and I put round after round into his shuddering body until at last he was still, an awful snarl fixed on his face. Anton fired into the darkness beyond the door. I wheeled round angrily, yelling, Petrov, it's dead. What? I stopped and slowly turned back towards the door. Howling and guttural cries rang in my ears. More glowing eyes appeared in the doorway, faint at first but growing ever closer as we watched. What are you waiting for? Run! I screamed. We turned and fled, across the room, back up the steps, through the hallway, into the elevator. No one looked back. We could hear them gaining on us. Anton was helped along by Yuri and I, but he was still forced to put weight on his leg as he jogged along, grimacing in pain. Come on, growled Yuri, jamming the button. Behind us we heard the pounding of many footsteps from the stairs. The doors slowly slid open, and Yuri and Anton slipped through them. Then the door shuddered and stopped. I squeezed through the doors and turned to see Roman desperately trying to tear the flamethrower off himself, but his hands were shaking too much. I can't get in, he yelled. I threw myself against one of the doors, and Yuri desperately tried to slide open the other. Anton leaned against the wall and fired over Roman's shoulder. The creatures that were once our comrades were hot on our heels. As Roman tried to force his way through the doors, the rest of us fired into the mob of monsters that forced their way down the hall. Bodies fell, some with too few or too many limbs, others whose bodies looked partially melted, some with freakishly elongated bodies and limbs so tall their heads grazed the ceiling, and countless other horrors I can't bring myself to describe. It wasn't enough. They kept coming, running, loping and crawling down the hall, making awful noises that made my hair stand on end as they echoed off the walls. At last, Roman stumbled through the doors, and I jammed the ground floor button. The door slid shut, and we listened to the thuds of the creatures throwing themselves against the doors and their howls of frustration as we slowly ascended. All of us rushed out the doors as soon as they opened, all sense of caution abandoned. I rushed blindly through the corridors of the plant, looking desperately for a way out. I don't know how long we ran through that maze of corridors. It might have been 5 minutes, maybe 5 hours, but eventually we made it outside. It was night, and our lights barely penetrated the inky blackness. Everyone tried to catch their breath and process what we'd seen. Feeling slightly calmer, I said, "Find the BTR. Stick together and don't let each other out of your sight. We're getting the hell out of here." Everyone nodded, and we set out cautiously, our nerves once again on edge. A loud splash to our left caused us to whirl around towards the source of the noise. Yuri fired a round into the darkness. "Stop it, you idiot! It's me!" came Anton's voice from around our feet. "What happened?" I asked, catching him in the light of my gun. He'd fallen into the cooling pond, the water glittering in the light. It was a sickly bluish-yellow color, and was no doubt incredibly radioactive. Anton frowned. I tripped over my rifle that I was using to support myself. Help me out, will you?" There was no railing, only a gently sloping concrete ramp that disappeared into the depths of the pond. I grabbed his hand and tried to pull him up, but Anton let his good leg go slack and started writhing around, splashing water everywhere. "Stop screwing around and let's go," I snarled, grabbing both of his arms and trying to pull him up to his feet. He was waist deep in the water, still twisting and splashing around. "I can't," he grunted. "My leg's stuck on something. It won't budge." Yuri joined me, and we each grabbed one of his arms. "Look, Anton, I don't have time for this. Get up and let's get moving before we attract unwanted attention." Anton frowned angrily. "I told you, my leg." Suddenly, he was pulled forward into the water, his head and torso going under. He thrashed around desperately, his muffled screams barely audible above the water. Yuri and I held on as we were pulled forward, trying to make sure our feet didn't touch the waterline. The man grabbed onto his arm with Yuri, but it was no use. "Yuri, use your gun," I yelled. Yuri grabbed his submachine gun and pointed it at the surface of the water as it splashed and churned. "What if I hit him?" I cut him off. "He's dead either way. Just do it." Yuri sprayed the water with bullets, and Roman and I fell backwards with Anton. I watched as the pond rippled, something sank back into the depths. I turned back to Anton. He hadn't been underwater long enough to completely saturate his gas mask, and his suit wasn't torn, so he wasn't in any immediate danger. Unfortunately, his gun and pack were gone, and after trying to help him up, it was evident that his good leg had been pulled out of its socket at the knee. "Leave me," groaned Anton. "I'll just slow you down." "No," I said firmly. "We're not leaving anyone behind." I expected him to argue, but when I looked down at him, he had passed out. We made a makeshift stretcher out of the tent in Yuri's pack and carried Anton while Roman took point. After an hour or so of stumbling blindly through the dark, we found one of the BTRs. The other one was gone. God knows where, but the other still parked, with the hatches unlocked and enough gas to get us out of Pripyat. Anton was still asleep, and Yuri soon followed suit. Roman and I stayed up and talked in hushed tones, unable to fall asleep. After a while, I thought of something that didn't make sense. Why didn't they wake us up? I asked Roman. How did they forget us? Roman shook his head. Maybe they thought we were in a different room and assumed we'd disappeared like Sergei. Maybe they saw the blood all over the room and assumed we were dead. Yeah, maybe some of them got dragged off before the rest of the guys found out. Then they went after the bastards, only they bit off more than they could chew. It doesn't really matter now, does it? I nodded. No, I guess it doesn't. We talked for another hour before Roman dozed off. Well, I'm exhausted. The hatches are all locked, so no one has to keep watch. I better get some rest. July 3rd, 1987. We drove out of the plant and took the quickest road out of Pripyat at dawn. Yuri drove while I sat in the passenger seat, keeping an eye out for any trouble. We encountered nothing, and the silence was almost worse. In spite of myself, I got more and more nervous. We were about halfway through Pripyat when a sharp hissing caused me to almost fall out of my seat. Yuri swerved on the road, almost crashing through a storefront before turning back onto it. I looked around wildly before realizing it was the radio. I laughed mirthfully, and Yuri joined in. My laughter abruptly died in my throat. Put my ear to the radio and thought I could hear faint words coming from it. I fiddled with the radio, and a man's voice, ragged and desperate, filled the BTR. We'll try again in 24 hours. Our location is... The voice was drowned out in a sudden burst of static. I turned to Yuri, my eyes wide. Someone else is out there. Other survivors, I said excitedly. Yuri nodded. We'll keep an ear out for them. We can't leave our comrades behind. I got up and walked to the back of the BTR. Anton was doped up on painkiller. We didn't have many, but it was as good a time as any to use them. Roman was sprawled out on the seat, half asleep. I nudged him awake. We heard people on the radio, other survivors, I said. Roman's eyes lit up, and he bolted upright. I love meeting you people, said Anton dreamily, staring at the ceiling. Roman and I were in deep discussion when a yell from Yuri up front got my attention. We both rushed to the driver's seat. What is it? I asked urgently. Roman's jaw dropped. Holy shit. It's Mikhail. It was. Roman and I grabbed our guns and climbed out of the BTR. He was huddled in an abandoned car, curled up into a ball and muttering to himself incoherently. His suit was stained and tattered, though he still had his gas mask. His backpack was gone and he was missing everything except for his combat knife, which he clutched tightly in his hand. We stood for a moment, staring at him with uncertainty. I think he's gone off the deep end, said Roman quietly. I nodded. I would be too if I'd been in this hellscape alone for so long. Mikhail finally noticed us. He looked up and stared at me before he whimpered and crawled to the back of the car. It took a while, but we eventually managed to coax him out with a candy bar. We took him back to the BTR, and I made sure to have my pistol out, just in case. Once we got moving again, we tried talking to him, hoping that maybe he wasn't too far gone. Once I took his knife and gave him some rations, he calmed down a little. On closer inspection, the lack of protection from the radiation had taken its toll on him. His hair was falling out, and there were red stains on his suit where he coughed up blood. He was lucky to be alive. He must have gotten one last decent-sized dose of radiation soon before we picked him up, since some of the blood in his suit was fresh. We never got a chance to talk to him or try to bring him back to sanity. An hour or so later, Roman and I were up front with Yuri, debating whether to head for the camp or hunker down for the night, when Anton's voice floated from the back of the BTR. He'd been given more morphine, but this time his dreamy, carefree tone of voice was tinged with fear. "Mikhail, are you okay?" No, stay away from me," he said. "Get back," he screamed, followed by rapid gunfire. We grabbed our rifles and raced to the back of the vehicle to find Anton, his face pale, a pistol in his shaking hand. Mikhail lay face down in a pool of his own blood. Nobody spoke for a second. My stomach dropped and I felt for my pistol on my belt, but the holster was empty. "Why did you take my gun?" I asked, torn between confusion and a growing sense of anger. "Why the hell did you kill him?" I asked, my voice rising. Yuri knelt over the body and felt for a pulse. I stormed over and wrenched the gun out of his hand. Bullet casings were scattered around Anton. I checked the pistol. The clip was empty, the barrels were still warm. I was filled with rage. I don't know what I would have done to him if it wasn't for Roman. He pulled me away, muttering something in my ear. What it was, I don't recall. I stared at the ceiling, away from Anton and Mikhail, trying to calm myself down. Before I could think of anything to say, something grabbed me, and I was picked up and thrown into the wall with incredible force. I slid to the floor, dazed, trying to grab my rifle, only to find it wasn't hanging on my shoulder anymore. My vision was blurry, and I watched as the dark outline of something threw itself at one of my colleagues, whether Roman or Yuri, I couldn't tell. I tried to get up, but felt a searing pain in my wrist as I tried to push myself up. My ears were ringing, but I still heard muffled yelling and machine gun fire. Bullets ricocheted off the inside of the steel compartment, and I felt white-hot pain as one buried itself in my shoulder. And I heard other things, sounds no human should make, guttural wailing that tripped every survival instinct in my body, and, battered though I was, I tried to crawl away from the noise. I didn't get far before something else slammed into me. It hung limply over me, and I tried and failed to push it off. The sounds around me faded, and I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, my head was pounding, and I was covered in bruises. The lights were out, with the only light source being the now open top hatch above me. The visor of my gas mask was smeared with blood. I looked up to see Yuri lying on top of me. He had deep cuts covering his body, and his neck was twisted at an unnatural angle. After several tries, I managed to push Yuri off of me and get to my feet. My suit was absolutely covered in his blood. Everything hurt. My head was swimming, and it was still hard to stand up. With difficulty, I pulled myself together and surveyed the compartment. Blood, bullet casings, and the contents of Yuri's and I's packs were spread all over the floor. A nasty-looking creature with 7 spider-like legs, an emaciated torso, and a grotesque, misshapen head lay near the top hatch, surrounded by shredded, bloody clothing. Roman, Anton, and Mikhail were nowhere to be seen. As quietly as I could manage, I found my rifle, walked over to the body, and gingerly nudged it with my boot. No response. I put a few rounds into it, just to be sure. I didn't bother cleaning out the mess. I tried everything, but the BTR wouldn't start. It took a long time for me to figure out what was wrong. It was out of gas. By this time it was late in the afternoon. I marked the way to the old campsite with one of the maps we'd been issued with, then buttoned up the hatches. It's dark now, and with the ruckus that we made earlier, there are things outside trying to get in. For the most part, though, all I hear is movement outside, scratching or banging on the hatches. Well, sometimes, though, I swear I can hear whispers. They're faint, but I can hear them. I can't tell what they're saying, and to be honest, I'd rather not know. Tomorrow I'll make my way to the camp, see if there are any survivors, or at least a vehicle I can use. Oh, I just heard the whispers again. Come out, they say. It's not so bad. I need to get some sleep. I'm imagining things. I have to be. I don't think I can live with the alternative. July 4th, 1987. I made a new friend today. His name's Vasya. Well, it is now anyhow, seeing as whoever named him before me is most likely dead, or an unholy abomination now, so their opinion doesn't count for much. Vasya is a husky, probably one of the last non-mutated animals in Pripyat. I guess he had enough sense to stay on the outskirts of the city. I set out this morning for the camp, and almost every few blocks I had to deal with some new shambling horror. After a few hours of walking, I stopped and listened. Loud barks and whining could be heard from an alley off to my left. I briefly considered moving on, but decided to investigate. As I turned into the alley, I saw a wolf, its back to me, advancing on a mangy dog cowering against the wall behind it. It was clearly starving, and it had a deep cut that began at its snout and stopped at its tail. It appeared fresh, and the glistening red wound seemed to run right on top of its spine. The dog kept its head down and alternated between whimpers and aggressive barks. Neither did anything to deter the wolf as it continued towards its prey. It was odd to see two normal, somewhat healthy animals in the city after everything that had happened, I thought to myself. As if on cue, the moment the thought entered my head, the wolf's head and shoulders split vertically to reveal a huge mouth and huge, spiky teeth lining the insides. A thin, very long tongue emerged, lashing about like a whip. Before I even thought about what I was doing, I flipped the safety off of my AK-47 and emptied a full clip into the beast's back. It staggered forward, oozing blood tinged with a sickly green. I fumbled for another clip on my belt as it stumbled towards me, snarling. Just as I slid a fresh clip in and chambered around, the dog rushed up to the thing and sank its teeth into its flank. I held my fire as they wrestled with each other. Eventually, I got a clear shot and sent a burst straight down its throat. The wolf howled in agony, snapped its horrid maw shut, and ran unevenly past me down the street. I plucked a grenade off of my belt and tossed it just behind it. I threw myself into the cover of the alley and felt the explosion rattle my teeth and shake the ground ever so slightly. I picked myself up and peered around the corner. In the wolf's place, there was a pulpy mess of red and metal fragments splattered across the street. I turned and focused my attention on the dog. It sat there, staring up at me. I reached out a hand, but it growled and edged away. "Okay, boy, I get it. I'll stay away," I said, edging out onto the street. I walked for another 2 blocks and then stopped again. I turned to see the dog following me, keeping a good distance away. It stopped and sat, and when I tried to get close, it bared its teeth and growled at me. I backed off and kept walking. This process repeated itself for most of the afternoon, but as the hours passed, he trotted closer and closer behind me, until, as the sun started to set, he was walking by my side. I settled down for the night in an apartment building on the highest floor. I barricaded the door into the room I'd selected and pushed a bookshelf in front of the only window, just in case something tried to climb in. After offering the dog some meat from my rations and talking softly to it for a while, he let me pet him. I'm happy to have the company, even if he tried to lick my face, only to smear drool all over my gas mask visor. I'll call you Vasya, I thought out loud. That's my brother's name, I added, turning to face Vasya. It's a nice name, I think. Don't you think so? Vasya barked agreeably. Tomorrow's looking up. If I could only forget about yesterday. Or the day before that. Or the day before that. July 5th, 1987. I found the camp today. It was late in the morning when I saw it from the apartment complex where I'd stopped to rest. It was only a few blocks away. I checked it out through my scope. It wasn't as bad as I expected. Despite the damage, there were clear signs of life. There were scorch marks on the pavement where bodies had been burned, and it looked as if the survivors had moved into the surrounding buildings. Barricades made from wrecked trucks, sandbags and crates surrounded the perimeter. I was well rested, too. After my encounter with the wolf, I hadn't encountered a single living thing, well, aside from Vasya. On my way to the camp, the good luck continued. I didn't run into any trouble. When I got there, I crept into the camp, rifle in hand. I wasn't going to take any chances. Turns out, neither were they. As I opened the door to the closest building, I saw a group of men huddled around a card table with a map spread out on it, arguing in hushed tones and glancing down at the map every so often. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. Then Vasya trotted in and started running circles around the group, barking excitedly. The group turned in surprise, some of them fumbling for their sidearms. The man bent down to examine the dog before turning to me. His eyes widened. "Nikolai!" he yelled. "Roman, you're alive!" I exclaimed. But something wasn't right. Instead of looking relieved, Roman looked suspicious instead. "How can I be sure it's really you?" he asked. I was confused. I wanted to argue, but something heavy slammed into the back of my head, and everything went black. I woke up in a bedroom with no windows and a heavy oak door that was locked. There was a bookshelf packed with novels, all state-approved, of course. So there's at least something to keep me occupied. The only other furniture in the room is an ornately carved wooden table with 3 chairs and a bed. There's a guard outside, I think. I hear footsteps outside every so often. I'm not sure why they're so suspicious of me. They took away everything but my journal, some pencils, and my sleeping bag. I don't know where Vasya is, but I hope he's safe. Well, I'll get some rest. Perhaps this mess will make sense in the morning. July 8th, 1987. For the past few days, not much has happened. They took blood samples from me. For what, I really don't know. Then they had a medic examine me while an armed guard stood in the corner. I'm still not sure why they're holding me here. My patience is waning, but for now, I'm somewhat content. I have steady, if meager, rations given to me, and a safe place to sleep. Vasya is in the room next to me. They didn't tell me when I asked, but I heard him barking and scratching at the wall earlier, so he's safe, for now. If they decide he's too much trouble, I have no doubt they'll get rid of him. Roman came in the afternoon to talk. It was more of an interrogation, to be precise. We sat on opposite ends of the table, him with his back to the door. I told him everything that happened after we separated, and he scribbled notes on a clipboard as I talked. When I finished, he stood up and made to leave. "Wait," I said, rising up out of my chair. "Aren't you going to tell me how you got here?" He regarded me with suspicion. "I'm sorry, but I have work to do. Maybe tomorrow. We'll see," he replied, turning towards the door again. I lost my composure and slammed my fist on the table. "Well, will you at least tell me how long you're going to keep me locked up in this room? Or why?" I yelled, shoving the table away from me and stomping towards him. I stopped just inches from his face. "You left me to frickin' die out there," I hissed. I thought you were dead. We were exposed out in the open, with the BTR dead. I couldn't get back to the camp with much time to spare. Look, if it makes you feel any better. I tried, but Anton was the only one who was conscious. He's downstairs, he replied, emotion entering his voice for the first time. Do you have him locked up too? Or am I just special? I snarled, my anger flaring up once more. No, he's not. I only had time to drag him into one of the buildings and set up camp before night. They're more active then. I thought if you weren't dead before, well, you would be then, he said. Look, if I'd known you weren't. He trailed off. I could see the guilt in his expression. But I had no sympathy. How about Mikhail? I asked. No answer. I said, what about? I stopped at the feeling of something being jammed into my chest. I looked down to see Roman's pistol. Back off, he said coolly. Staring daggers at him, I retreated to the center of the room. If it helps, you might be out of here tomorrow. I really hope you will be. We can talk more then, he said, looking at me with guilt, wariness, pity. Go to hell, I retorted, turning my back to him. I heard a sigh, then the door being closed and the bolt sliding back into place over the door. Reliving this in my head while writing it down is getting me angry all over again. I better sit and read for a bit to calm down. July 9th, 1987. A lot happened, or rather, I learned a lot today. It's all a little hard to process. Early this morning I was shaken awake by Roman. You're good to go. Come downstairs, I'll explain everything, he said. Oh, happy fucking day, I muttered, sitting up and following him out of the room. I swear, you're sounding more and more like Anton every day, Roman chuckled as we descended the stairs. My things were on a chair, and some notebooks and rations were on the folding table I'd seen earlier. Have a seat, offered Roman, grabbing a ration pack and sitting himself next to me. We ate in silence for a bit before he finally spoke up. We thought you might have been dangerous, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. Like Mikhail. Wait, what? Anton killed Mikhail. If anyone's dangerous, it's him, I laughed. Roman slowly shook his head. Anton didn't kill Mikhail. I wish he had. It took 4 clips of ammo to bring him down, but not before he got Yuri. And you, he added. I leaned back in my seat, my head spinning. How? I asked. And where did you bury him? Roman frowned. What do you... He stopped. Oh, he said. No, you don't understand. That spider thing in the BTR? That was Mikhail. He, shed his skin, almost, and knocked you out before we could even react. Christ, it all happened so fast. He sighed. We really don't understand how it works. Our best guess is, at the moment, it's radiation exposure, and possibly transmission of fluids. Obviously, we're not going to test that theory, but from what I can tell, Mikhail was just exposed to less radiation over a long period of time than the ones at the plant. It made the process a kind of slow burn, I guess, until... He shrugged. Until we found him at exactly the wrong time. I finished for him. He chuckled wryly. Pretty much. We talked for a long time after that. He told me about how he'd barely made it to the camp, being attacked almost every step of the way. When he finished, I nodded. It wasn't easy for me either, but the attack stopped once I got a couple of blocks away. You guys did a good job of clearing out the area. Roman frowned. We didn't. Going even a block from the camp alone is just asking to get jumped by something. Well, guess I got lucky then, I said, grinning. Well, I think it might have been more than that, replied Roman, standing up. Follow me. I need to show you something. We walked into a hallway that led deeper into the building. After a few twists and turns, we arrived at a staircase leading down into what must have been the basement. As we made our way down the stairs, Roman started talking again. We have 17 people here. Our group has 3 non-coms, including you, and 2 medics. The ward medic, Ninel. He used to be a surgeon before he joined up. He's the one who checked you out earlier. We've got no officers left, and the non-coms don't really have authority here. Everyone pretty much has an equal say in what our next move is. And what is our next move? I inquired as we reached the bottom of the stairs. I entered a room with tables covered in folders, pieces of papers with notes scribbled on them, and various lab equipment like test tubes and beakers. Getting the hell out of here. Problem is, we're almost out of gas, and without vehicles, a group that large is bound to attract trouble. We're trying to reach out to the troops outside the city, but no luck so far with that. In the corner was the medic I'd seen earlier, bent over a table with a dead body on it. We walked over, and I suddenly felt sick. On the table next to it was another body, this one bearing a humanoid figure. It was another of those monstrous creatures. Ninel has been studying the creatures we've encountered and their connection to normal humans. Hopefully we can find a weakness or perhaps a way to reverse the process of becoming one of them. But so far, not much progress has been made, Roman explained. I looked closer. Both bodies had their chests cut open and their organs exposed. Ninel looked up from what he was doing. You remember Nikolai, right, Ninel? Asked Roman. Ninel nodded. I do. Come over here and I'll show you why we needed that blood sample from you. He motioned us over to a table with more test tubes. He gestured to one tube with a small amount of blood in it. This is yours, he said. He pointed to the one next to it, this one having blood that was slightly different. It had a very faint discoloration, a yellow-greenish tinge that I knew all too well. This one's from the thing on the table, I asked. Ninel nodded. It is. From the tests I ran, I found that this blood is a good deal more radioactive. I took a step back. Ninel added, It's not enough to be really dangerous. As long as you don't swallow it, you will be fine. Now, Roman says you didn't encounter any other trouble after you found that dog, correct? I nodded. He continued. We did the same tests with the dog. It appears, I'm afraid, that the dog has most likely been turned. In rare cases we've seen creatures that still resemble their original forms, at least until they attack. I sputtered. But when I found him, he was getting attacked by one of those things, and he had plenty of chances to kill me, so why didn't he? Ninel nodded thoughtfully, saying, Well, from what we've seen, these things can be very territorial. The second one, though, that I can't answer. We think that you entered the dog's territory, so to speak. That's why you didn't run into anything once you met him, added Roman. Ninel rummaged through some notes on a table, pulling out a sheet and scanning it before turning back to us. The body's the first to go. It mutates and deforms quickly after a large enough dose of radiation. Something in that process, I'm not sure what, alters their bodies so they can survive extreme radiation exposure. After that, once a dose that would normally be lethal is reached, their mind is altered and twisted until they become killing machines in mind as well as body. Roman spoke up in a worried voice. I never did ask. Do altered humans keep their intelligence? Ninel shuddered. I hope not. If they do, then... He was cut off by an explosion somewhere outside. Muffled yells and machine gun fire came from upstairs. Roman swore. Oh, something's breached the perimeter. Let's move. Ninel ran over to a radio set while Roman and I rushed upstairs. Here, yelled Roman, tossing me an AK-47 from a rack near the door. Ammo is in the crates in the corner. Pick a window and start shooting. A howling mob of mutated beasts made their way towards the building. Men with HMGs and sniper rifles opened fire from the other floors, mowing them down. It was only then that I noticed some of them wore tattered uniforms, others hazmat suits slashed to ribbons, evidence of the past failed expeditions into this radioactive hell on Earth. One of them, a woman with an axe lodged in her stomach and freakishly long arms and legs, climbed on top of a burned-out truck and launched herself up at the building. From the floor above, I heard glass shatter, and then screaming. It cut off suddenly. Panic shouts and sounds of a struggle. I watched, startled, as a man was thrown from one of the windows above. He landed at an awkward angle, and even from where I was, I heard his legs snap. He desperately tried to crawl back to safety. We desperately tried to keep the hordes off him. We got to him anyway and began tearing him apart. Someone put a bullet in his brain to stop the screaming. For an hour, we held them off. There were just so many. Eventually, we retreated to the second floor during a lull in the fighting, taking what supplies we could with us. Well, the stairs are blocked off, but they'll find us before long. Ninel, Roman, and Anton all made it. Ninel is still trying to contact the outside world for help. Still, I doubt he'll get any response. Not in time, anyhow. Our numbers have been cut down to 12, and 4 of those are wounded. We're screwed, and we all know it. Nothing to do but keep fighting, I guess. My shift on guard duty is up. If I'm lucky, I'll still be alive to make an entry in the morning. July 10th, 1987. Well, I'm still here. How much longer, I don't know. At this point, I don't really care anymore. They broke into the second floor just after midnight. We'd already moved the wounded and most of our gear to the roof, so we didn't have to worry about that. As we made a fighting retreat to the next floor, I passed by the room where Vasya had been kept. The door was open. I didn't think about it until I saw Vasya running towards me as I went up the steps. At first, I was glad to see him. And then his skin started to split open at the wound along his back. I watched, frozen, as 8 spider-like legs emerged, pulling the skin away as they did. It peeled away the skin on his face, exposing the skull. I snapped out of it and raced up the stairs and into a hallway where the others were waiting. The thing I'd called Vasya followed. Everyone opened fire as he attacked, impaling one soldier on the wall with one of his legs. He pulled it back and the man fell down, gushing blood. He ran erratically among us before jumping up and tearing out the throat of the man next to me. All the while, the bullets only seemed to make him, even angrier. 2 more men died before a grenade finished it all. I caught up with Roman as we retreated even further. "Looks like you were right," I said glumly. "That was the dog? Jesus Christ," Roman replied. "Hey, you didn't know. It's not your fault." I nodded, not really believing it myself. At dawn, after we'd been pushed back to the 7th floor, the roof was just above us. There was no more retreating. I was considering whether or not to shoot myself and get it over with, when Roman ran over to me, grinning. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I paused while reloading, and heard only the howls of the monsters coming out, and the shots from them trying to stave them off. "Yeah, that's the things that are going to eat us alive. Not much to smile about," I replied. "Not that," he said. "Listen." Then I heard the steady whirring, faint but getting louder. I gasped. No way. "Oh, hell yes way," Roman said, still grinning crazily. "Oh, it's a chopper. We're getting out of here," I whooped. "We're not going to die." By the time the helicopter touched down on the roof, though, I wasn't so sure. We had to get out onto the roof, and they were coming at us faster than we could shoot. Their corpses formed a mound next to the stairs to the roof, and their living comrades spewed out onto it, crawling over their comrades' bodies to reach us. Behind us, the wounded, including Anton, and a few crates with Ninel's research were loaded onto the helicopter. Some of the men swept the rooftop with heavy machine guns mounted on the sides. And finally, the few remaining survivors, myself included, could get on board. As we took off, a few creatures managed to latch on to the bottom. One of the men was sliding the side door shut when a thing with 4 arms and a worn officer's uniform crawled up and tried to force its way in. It latched itself onto the guy, ripping off his gas mask and clawing at his face with 2 hands, while the other 2 pulled it inside the copter. Get it off of me, he wailed as it tore into him. I charged into them, sending the pet tumbling out of the copter. I hurried to close the door, but not in time to miss the sickening crunch as their bodies hit the ground. It was quiet for a long time, until at last the pilot broke the silence. Almost out of the quarantine zone. It's a good thing you got picked up. The checkpoints on the ground are in lockdown. As for our actual landing, ETA 15 minutes. Everyone cheered half-heartedly. Well, a lot of time had passed since I'd been resupplied. There was enough vodka in my pack to help me forget for a little while. I'd forgotten it was there, and I was glad for it. I passed out just as we started to land, and I woke up in quarantine. They left our things with us, although they're going to have to decontaminate it once we're out of here. I couldn't care less. I'd like to sleep for a long, long time. Anything to stop me remembering what happened in the ruins of Chernobyl. Lieutenant Nikolai Smirnov, Spetsnaz Commando, October 2nd, 1987. Well, it's been a long time since I've made an entry here, and a lot has changed. I have a new Spetsnaz team now. There's me, the leader, Anton, who's finally healed well enough to return to combat, Roman, the sergeant and second in command, and Ninel, our medic and scientist. I got promoted to first lieutenant back in June after the mission in Pripyat. Since then, our team has focused almost exclusively on the paranormal. Unfortunately, the missions I've been on are either too disturbing, too classified, or both, so I won't be writing about any of that. Right now, we're on a helicopter en route to investigate an anomaly in the Carpathian mountains of Ukraine. Other than that, they've told us nothing. Of course, it's possible they know as little as we do about what we're facing, but I don't know which is worse. But then, this is standard operating procedure for these kinds of missions. Get the job done, even if you're not exactly sure what you have to do. Just perfect. October 3rd, 1987. As per usual, everything's gone to hell. The helicopter's instruments stopped working not too far from the LZ. The pilots tried to keep us in the air, but the best they could do was a controlled crash in a part of the mountains with fewer trees to crash into than the area around it. Controlled might be too strong a word, though. The impact still knocked us all out. I was the first to come to. The helicopter was damaged but upright, and most of the weapons and gear we'd brought was scattered in and around the copter. I checked on everyone to see if there were any injuries. All of us, including the pilot and co-pilot, were okay, except for a few bruises. Unfortunately, although the copter isn't badly damaged, it still refused to start. Our radios had stopped working too. Not even static, just silence on all channels. It was late in the afternoon by the time we got everything sorted, so we'll stay here for tonight. Tomorrow we'll walk to the base we were supposed to land at, and have them send somebody to clean up the crash sites. I can tell which way we need to go from the maps we brought and my compass, so there shouldn't be any trouble finding the place. I let everyone know what the plan was just before we turned in for the night. I guess nobody bothered to send a search party out once a whole damn helicopter goes missing, groused Anton. Oh my God. Could you bitch a little more, please? Said Roman. Ah, shove it, Anton replied as the rest of us howled with laughter. Can't hear you, said Roman cheerfully. Anton said something different this time, and it was a lot more creative, albeit more offensive than shove it. This crash is a pain, but it's not the end of the world. We'll be back at base and on the mission in no time. Well, that's all for today. I need a good night's sleep for the trip to the base tomorrow. October 4th, 1987. Well, I did have a little trouble getting to the base, but it looks like our troubles have only just begun. Our hike to the base began soon after dawn. We brought as much gear as we could with us, just in case. About halfway through the trip, it started to snow, lightly at first, and then wet, heavy flakes that covered the landscape in white. Visibility dropped to just 5 or so meters in each direction once it got windy, and the snowfall got even heavier. Nobody knew how close we were to the base until I literally walked into it. Cursing and rubbing my nose, I stepped back from the rusted fence I'd walked into. I radioed command, then the base. Neither responded. We went in through a downed section of the fence. Once inside, we explored further. The base consisted of around half a dozen crumbling concrete buildings and a small airstrip with cracked pavement and weeds sprouting from the cracks. I don't think anyone's home, boss, said Roman, scanning the area uneasily. Aside from the whistling of the wind through the buildings, there was utter silence. Maybe this is an old base, not the one we're looking for, just one nearby that was abandoned, suggested Anton, but the pilot shook his head. I've been here plenty of times. This is the place. In fact, I was in contact with them just before we crashed. Plus, there's no other bases out here. Only one place like this. So, what? Everyone on the base decided to take a break at the same time. I wouldn't even call this a base. Look at it, said Anton, pointing to the buildings. I notice now that some even had broken windows, and one, the barracks by the looks of it, even had an entire wall caved in. This place is a dump. The co-pilot looked around at the now empty base before saying, Yeah, but this place was nothing like this a week ago. Me and Vaz here, he gestured to the pilots. We dropped off supplies here and the place looked nothing like this. I mean, it was built just last year. We've been running supplies and ferrying troops there ever since. Vaz nodded at the co-pilot. Mal's right. This can't be the same place. I held up my hand for silence. I don't know what's going on either, but standing around talking isn't going to solve anything. Split up into pairs and search the buildings, then meet back here in 2 hours. We'll stay here overnight and try to contact someone and find out what's going on. Keep an eye out for anything we can use to patch up the helicopter too. Otherwise, we might be stranded here till they send someone to pick us up. I went with Roman. Didn't take long for us to realize nobody had been here for a long, long time. The base must have been abandoned for years, if not decades. No remains, not even skeletons, so it wasn't from anything violent. Once everyone got back together, we set up camp in the old hangar. The pilot and co-pilot were dismantling one of the helicopters for spare parts and siphoning fuel from the rest of the aircraft. We'll go back to the crash site tomorrow and head back to Central Command in Moscow. Still silence on all channels, unfortunately. Ninel says the snowstorm might be interfering with the signal. I'll try again tomorrow if the storm lets up. It's thundering now, too. October 5th, 1987. Still nothing on the radio. The storm did let up, though, aside from the occasional thunder in the distance. We got back to the crash site without any trouble. The helicopter got fixed, and everything we'd brought, plus all the fuel we could carry, was loaded on board. It was late in the afternoon when we got back in the air, and the pilot headed east. After we'd left the mountains, and it had long since stopped snowing, in the fading daylight I saw craters and what looked like vehicles scattered about the landscape. I ordered the pilot to fly lower for a closer look. As we got closer to the ground, I saw crashed jets and helicopters, knocked out tanks, and burnt-out armored vehicles of every shape and size. All looked more advanced than anything I'd seen in my military career. Scorch marks and craters dotted the land, too, evidence of airstrikes or possibly artillery. It didn't look at all recent, but clearly a massive battle had taken place here. We moved on, sometimes going over small towns that looked deserted. Occasionally they, too, had evidence of a battle. I tried the radio again. Silence. Oh, there's no good place to stop for the night, so the pilot and co-pilot will take shifts flying. We've talked with the others, and they know as well as I do that there's no way war could break out overnight. Something's not right here, and I suspect it's got something to do with that anomaly we were called in to investigate. October 6th, 1987. Today we found a command post in the remnants of a huge tank battle, atop which flew the flag of the Russian Federation rather than the USSR. Near the border between the Russian and Ukrainian SSR, we touched down to investigate. Inside we found news bulletins, maps with troop positions and movements in the area, and several skeletons, mostly wearing officers' uniforms. Roman found a world map and took it off the wall. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. Nikolai, I don't think we're in the USSR anymore. I examined the map. Most of Europe and North America were outlined in blue, and Russia, not the USSR. The countries that formed it were split off. China, Brazil, India, and South Africa were all in red. Lower Asia and parts of South America also had bits of red and blue. In the map key, blue was marked as NATO, which we all knew, but the red were marked with BRICS, apparently our side's faction. After looking around a bit longer, we took off and continued towards Moscow. I think, said Ninal, after a long silence, that we have somehow stumbled into another dimension. Are you, any of you, familiar with the concept of the multiverse? Everyone shook their head. Ninal just sighed and didn't bother trying to explain himself any further. He was about to continue when the pilot interrupted him with a cry of shock. My God, what happened to Smolensk? Everyone peered outside. I felt my stomach drop. Below us, Smolensk was a massive crater. Buildings knocked flat, and even those on the outskirts of the city reduced to ruins. Nukes, said Ninel. Nothing else can tear apart a city like that. Everyone nodded in solemn agreement. We'd all learned Hiroshima and Nagasaki in school. Oh, I think I like our dimension better, said Anton. Me too, but we don't know how to get back there. We just have to hope someone in Moscow can help. No one asked what we would do if Moscow and other major cities had been nuked as well, but I could tell they were thinking it. I'm glad they didn't ask. I'm not sure I could have given a good answer. October 7th, 1987. Once the helicopter arrived at the outskirts of Moscow in the morning, I saw to my relief that the capital had been spared from nuclear annihilation. Still, bombing raids had devastated the city on their own. As we got closer to the center of the city, I saw literal paths of destruction. In more or less straight lines, buildings had been knocked flat and ground down to rubble. The ones that still stood were sleeker and more modern than our Moscow, and stretched up to dizzying heights. They would have been more impressive if they'd not clearly been abandoned months before. With no one to perform upkeep, they decayed as readily as any corpse. In the distance, scattered across the horizon, I spotted massive craters of which I could see no bottom. Once at the LZ, Roman, Anton, and I had to go in on foot. Vaz, Mal, and Ninel stayed behind. I'll be in touch, said Ninel over the radio as the helicopter took off again. We discovered that our headquarters was a few blocks from where it stood in our world. It was still hard to get to, with old barricades, destroyed or abandoned tanks, and vast amounts of rubble filling the streets. It was as quiet as it had been in Chernobyl. Aside from the whistling of the wind through the dead city, there were no noises except ours as we picked our way through the ruins. Skeletons were everywhere, in cars, buried under mounds of twisted steel and concrete, in the ruined buildings, wearing tattered army and civilian clothes alike. When we finally got inside, the elevator to the sub-basements had a keypad that none of us knew the code for. Roman planted Semtex on the doors and blasted them open. Next to the deafening silence around us, the explosion seemed even louder than usual. One by one, we rappelled down the elevator shaft. No one was here to help, but if we were going to get information on this portal, or whatever it was that took us here, this was where we would find it. No lights at the bottom worked, obviously, so we used our flashlights. Unfortunately, most of the tech that might have held records we needed were either too advanced to use, too badly damaged, or both. Eventually I came to a room with faint lighting coming from a corner of the ceiling. Some of the water pipes must have burst because a thin layer of filthy water coated the floor. I found a hole big enough for a man that looked like it twisted all the way up to the surface. Well, from the sunlight shining through. I called the others over. I decided we would investigate. As Roman and Anton climbed into the shaft, I looked over the room one last time. In a dark corner, I spied a skeleton in a major's uniform. I saw something else too. A book was in the skeletal finger's grasp. I picked it up and flipped through it, glancing at the pages. It was a journal. Perhaps it might give us answers about what had happened here. I squinted at the dog tags around the dead major's neck. Roman called. "Are you coming, boss?" His voice was echoing through the shaft. "Yeah, I'll be right up," I yelled, slipping the journal in my backpack. Once I got to the surface, I radioed Ninel to pick us up. We're headed to Leningrad now, so it'll be a much longer trip. The journal appears to have had some water damage, so I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Best to be careful so I don't destroy it. This is the best lead we've got. We can't afford to lose it. As always, the radio is silent. We're flying through another snowstorm, worse than the others. The thunder is the worst it's ever been. I hope lightning doesn't strike the helicopter. Visibility is awful, and the howling wind, even inside the copter, makes it hard to get any sleep. That won't stop me from trying, though. October 8th, 1987. Rations are running low. There's enough for another 3 days or so, but we still have no idea how to get back to our own dimension. Time's running out, and everyone knows it. It's late in the afternoon, and there's about another day's worth of flying until we reach Leningrad. As always, empty towns and battlegrounds full of destroyed or abandoned war machines, and the skeletons of the men who crewed them. This morning, Anton, Roman, and I searched another battlefield for supplies while the copter circled overhead. The snowstorm kept us from seeing very far, so we kept close so nobody could get separated. Every now and then I would find rations in packs or burnt-out supply trucks. Everything looked as if it had already been picked over. If nuclear war had caused the government to break down, I could easily see people looting once food got scarce. The absence of ammunition and guns made it clear they'd been willing to fight for it too. Later on, we passed tanks crushed into the ground, howitzers crumbled into scrap metal, and the remains of downed fighter jets. The wind started to pick up, and snow started to fall again. Vaz and Mal couldn't pick us up until visibility was back to normal. But it only got worse as time went on, though. I almost walked into the wall in front of me. Instead, Roman did. "What the hell is this?" he exclaimed angrily, rubbing his nose. I turned my attention to the wall. It was pale, bleached white, which explained how none of us had seen it before now. It looked to be a couple of stories tall at least, and stretched out as far as I could see in both directions. That didn't change as the storm let up and visibility got back to some semblance of normal. Finally, my radio crackled. "This is Vaz. The storm looks like it's past. We don't know where you went, though. We lost you in the storm." I had Anton send up a flare. As the helicopter circled lower, I heard gasps of surprise over the radio, followed by silence and excited talking in the background. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Oh, you're going to have to see it for yourself once you're on board," Laz said, sounding shaken. Once we were up in the air, I saw what the commotion had been about. Lying across the vast plains, surrounded by what had to be hundreds of wrecked tanks, planes, and the like, was an impossibly massive skeleton. With a shudder, I realized the wall Roman had walked into, the one that was so long I couldn't see any end to it, was in fact one of its leg bones. Its humanoid shape was partially obscured by the snow. The sheer scope of the thing was clear, as by the time I could take in the whole thing at once, the wrecked war machines surrounding it were impossible to spot. Niel had no theories as to how such a monster could have existed or why. What he did say, though, did nothing to put us at ease. "I hope there's not more than one," he muttered distractedly as the helicopter fought through yet another snowstorm towards Leningrad. "I think it's almost midnight now. There's been thunder all night again. That's not what's been keeping me up." October 11th, 1987. Yesterday, Anton found an old cache of rations in a bunker near a good-sized city that had been reduced to rubble. I don't know what city or where it was. With the blizzards that are on and off all the time now, Vaz and Mal got lost pretty easily. We've also scavenged fuel from downed helis and supply dumps near the battlefields that seem to be everywhere in this world. Now that the team's well supplied, we can keep an eye out for a landmark or something else to try and find out where we are without having to worry about getting stranded or running out of food. Unfortunately, we haven't found any people yet. Not alive, anyway. We've decided to keep going north. Maybe we'll have an easier time finding a route to Leningrad that way. Meanwhile, I've been reading the journal I found to pass the time. Most of it has water damage, except for the parts of the second half, and there are some pages that are missing, but what I've read is, well, unsettling. The first complete entry I found was dated January 22nd, 2027. I copied the entry into my own journal. "NATO launched more nuclear strikes against us last night. We were listening to the reports when suddenly the radio cut out. When it came back again, it was much fainter and was sometimes cut off by bursts of static. Later this morning, we were told the Americans had nuked Moscow. After the cyber attacks that pretty much shut the internet down, it's a wonder that news reached us at all. Retaliatory strikes destroyed Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., London, Paris, and others I've already forgotten. Berlin, of course, has been radioactive ashes for weeks now. Christ, I wish they'd never used the Tsar bomb. Nobody should have that kind of power. Besides, however unpatriotic it may be, I know we are losing. With so many cities gone, our logistics have been thrown into utter chaos. Our advance into Eastern Europe has been checked, and now we're slowly losing ground. China has been a great help, but the troops they sent us are all but gone now. Sure, the tide can turn, but even if we do win, will there be anything left standing? I guess I'll just have to wait and see. Who knows? Maybe both sides will agree to a ceasefire and end the madness before more nukes are brought into play. I've seen what radiation exposure can do to people. After 3 years of war, the last one with nuclear exchanges between almost all the major world powers, I'm not sure how much more my Russia can withstand. Eventually, something's got to give. Well, some parts I don't have any context for, but some of it, like the cyber attack, I just don't understand. The next few pages are missing. The next 2 entries are incomplete, but they do seem important. Gas attacks too. But even that hasn't stopped them. Every day I hear about another road closing, another town going dark, another unit overrun. Soon we'll be out of Belarus and Ukraine, and then they will drive deep into the motherland. To make matters worse, the earthquakes have started up again, too. The epicenters always seem to be at or near the major cities, as if the nukes and carpet bombings haven't done enough already. On the bright side, the new headquarters I'm stationed at is much better than its predecessor. It's much better protected against bombing raids and quakes, and they've even managed to get most of the malware and other viruses of our computers. The satellites are supposed to be up and running in a week or so, so orbital strikes are back on the table. If only it were enough to turn the tide. I can hope that it will, but I fear it will only delay the inevitable. March 1st, 2027. With the blizzards that are sweeping western Russia reinforcements, we've managed to stop NATO's advance before it got too far into Russian territory. Unfortunately, the blizzards also show no signs of letting up anytime soon. With the roads constantly blocked by snowdrifts and visibility either bad or worse, neither side can bring supplies and reinforcements up to the front, or bring their air force into play. As long as this continues, we can't begin a counterattack to drive the enemy out of our country. To even the odds, some of the generals suggested using bioweapons. Thankfully, they were dismissed immediately, but I hope that things don't become desperate enough for some idiot with stars on his shoulders to get clearance to deploy them. It would be so easy for it to go horrifically wrong and send the 21st century equivalent of the Black Death through not only Europe, but the whole world. Some people have argued that things have gone too far and we should ask for peace. Well, they were dismissed as well, though. I wish people would take the idea more seriously. I think. And the rest of the entry is cut off. The next page is soaked with rainwater, and so are the rest of the pages in the book. Well, the last few pages are with writing that's less damaged, though. The entries are partially readable, and some words or whole paragraphs are too smudged to tell what was written. June 14th, 2027. Only got worse. The non-stop blizzards make it hard to get an idea of how tall they are, but there are reports of some up to 30 stories high. One of them came right up into the center of Moscow, and apparently it wasn't just an isolated incident. It's happening in most major cities in Russia, and our spies say the same is happening in Western Europe and the Americas as well. Our allies' reports are the same. The earthquakes seem to signify where they'll come up. Tunneling under us the whole time, they think. It drew them to the surface. Nobody knows how long they've been down there, but it was a hell of a long time. Hard to take them down without air support, but the units we poured from the front haven't been too much trouble. The problem is there's just so damn many of them. Our department's the one that's supposed to handle this, but with air travel impossible and moving on the ground only slightly easier, we aren't doing well. Radiation doesn't affect them. It just brings them more and more to the surface. Missile strikes do the job fine, but there aren't enough of them to go around. Ceasefire on all fronts, but with our military so weakened, it'll be tough even with ours and NATO's combined strength to fight back. Riots, food shortages, and evacuation of most cities are spreading our troops and our resources very thin. It's getting harder and harder to find time to write in my journal these days. There's too much going on, and too few people to handle it. The rest of the entry is cut off. The final entry is short and hastily written. July 1st, 2027. Moscow is in chaos. Even as I write this city is being torn apart. A dozen of those things came up yesterday. When I was in the sub-basement of our headquarters and the elevator isn't working, the stairs collapsed too. Even from down here I could hear the muffled cries of the crowds as they ran through the streets. It's quiet now, and anyone who's left up there is probably dead. I'm going to die down here. Nobody is coming to help us. I won't wait to starve to death. There's some cyanide capsules in the lab down the hall. I'm going out on my own terms. Goodbye. And that's how it ends. God, I hope we get out of this place soon. We can't survive here forever. We don't know how we got here, so I'll be damned if I know how we'll get out. I'm trying not to think about that. October 13th, 1987. Oh, we are back. But I'm not any less worried. Yesterday, as we neared the outskirts of Leningrad, the storms and thunder were at the worst I'd seen yet. As Vaz and Mal took us in lower so we could get our bearings, the rest of us talked. Well, shouted is more accurate, with the muffled thunder and howling wind. As we got low enough to be just above the tops of the buildings, or rather, what was left of them, a sudden burst of thunder just ahead of us shook us in our seats. Moments later, Vaz swung the helicopter to the right in an almost 90-degree angle. It was so sudden, it threw anyone who wasn't strapped into their seat, including me, into the left side of the copter. As I pulled myself up, movement outside the window next to me caught my eye. I turned just in time to see a structure that had to be an easy 50 stories tall pitch forward towards us, crashing down just behind where we'd been. I jumped back from the window, while everyone else rushed to it to see what had happened. Then, another burst of thunder, this one from just behind us, and the helicopter swerved left and picked up speed. As we headed deeper into the dead city, the buildings that were still upright rose in height, and so did we. We had to go even higher as the snow swirling around us got thicker and made it harder to see. For a little while, it was mostly quiet outside, and we talked about what had happened. Nobody, not even Ninal, could explain it completely. No lightning strike can bring down a building like that, he said. Maybe it wasn't, I spoke up. What if it was one of those things we saw 4 days ago? He could have knocked down the building easy enough. Ninal nodded. That's what I was thinking too. It would have to be a lot bigger than the one we saw, but that isn't too hard to believe considering what we've been through so far. Was it, the thunder then? Asked Roman. And this time Anton answered. Could have been that thing moving around. After all, something that big is gonna make a hell of a lot of noise. Ninal was writing in a notepad he'd pulled from his pocket. He looked up with dread on his face. Thunder during snowstorms is very rare, and with the constant thunder we've heard this whole time, it's possible none of it was thunder at all. And with the snowstorms, we could have had them all around us and never even seen them. Mal called from the cockpit. Makes sense to me. I've flown through thunderstorms before, and this sounded different. Not too different, and it didn't seem that important at the time. He was cut off with curses and a startled yell from Vaz. The copter turned sharply, narrowly missing a building that had appeared suddenly out of the dense snow, flying through the air. As I looked back, it suddenly turned and moved after us. It easily outpaced us. As it got closer, I saw 4 huge, bulbous eyes staring down at us. Its cat-like pupils followed our copter as we gained altitude. Hold on, yelled Vaz. He jerked the copter around, heading straight toward the creature. As we zoomed past it, it roared in anger. It was loud, even through the walls of the copter. It picked up speed as it turned and gave chase, pushing buildings out of its path with ease. Its massive size meant it wasn't agile, but then it didn't need to be. A huge six-fingered hand bigger than a house swung past the copter. His long claws seemed to miss by only meters. Another roar, but this time right in front of us. "Another one," cried Roman as the copter swung this way and that. I was sure this was the end of the road. Then the new giant roared and charged the first. As they fought, we zigzagged between the buildings to make sure we lost our pursuers. After a while, Vaz slowed to a stop in between two towers that were mostly intact. We hovered in the air for a few minutes while everyone calmed down and made sure that nothing was after us. "I think we're safe for now, anyhow," announced Mal. "Famous last words," Anton said under his breath. I gave him a pat on the back. "Chin up. We've made it this far, haven't we?" I told him. The building to our left trembled slightly. With a deafening crash, a massive arm punched through it, swiping blindly at the copter. Vaz tried to accelerate to get out of its path, but he was too slow. I could hear the sound of steel being torn apart as the helicopter was wrenched backwards. "It clipped the tail rotor. We're going down," cried Mal as the copter began to spin crazily and sink towards the ground. "You just had to open your mouth, didn't you?" yelled Anton as we were tossed around inside the copter. I saw the arm withdraw, leaving a gaping hole in the building. We fell slowly at first, and then the building structure finally gave out and it fell toward us. Vaz used what control he had left to get us out of its path, but in doing so he drifted too close to the opposite building. The main rotor tore into the side of it. It snapped, and the copter tumbled out of the sky. "Brace for impact," screamed Vaz, and then nothing. The helicopter slammed into the ground, and everything went black. I woke up sometime later in the ruined husk of the helicopter. I checked on the rest of my team first. Everyone was unconscious. All of us had plenty of minor cuts and bruises, and Roman's arm was bent at a disturbing angle, obviously broken. Mal was dead, slumped in the co-pilot's chair with a chunk of glass from the shattered windshield lodged in his chest. I went outside and looked around. To my amazement, not only was there no snow falling or thunder, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The next thing I noticed was that we weren't anywhere near where we'd crashed. There were no buildings in sight, only what looked to be miles of forest and mountains in every direction. Behind me, I heard Ninale exclaim, "Oh my God, we're exactly where we crashed the first time 9 days ago." I spun around and saw him leaning against a tree, staring at the mountains. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded. "Does that mean we're back home?" "I think so. Yes, I hope so," he replied. The rest of the day was a blur. Anton and I hiked back to the base, which we found to not be abandoned. We really were home. After the rest of the team and the remains of the helicopter were recovered, we were sent to the infirmary. I got the best sleep I'd had in almost 2 weeks that night. When I woke up, today, I asked one of the medics how long we'd been gone. He looked confused and said, "Your helicopter crashed just yesterday. You were only missing a few hours." But we were out there for almost 2 whole weeks. That can't be right." He shook his head. "No. You crashed yesterday, October 3rd. Tomorrow's the 4th. I don't know how that could be. I asked Ninel when I saw him, and he told me, I can't be sure, but I think that it might not have been an alternate dimension. I believe we were thrown first forwards and then backwards in time. The anomaly we were going to investigate may have been a wormhole of some sort. It would make sense." We didn't talk much after that. Oh, if that's our future, we can't really change it, can we? Or maybe we can, but if we can't. October 4th, 1987. It turns out I have 2 cracked ribs, so I can't go anywhere just yet. They brought me my bag and I went through it to see what had survived the crash. It was open when the helicopter went down, so a lot of things were either lost or destroyed. Of the journal I'd found, only the cover was left. It must have been torn off, but where the rest went, I don't know. Oh, I'd really hoped that it would be intact since I was the only one who'd ever read it. I was thinking about that as I turned the cover over in my hands. I stopped. I stared in shock. I grabbed my own journal and looked at the inside of the cover. I looked back at the torn off cover. No, I whispered. The ink was smudged, but the handwriting was still legible. I saw now, too, how similar it was to my own. In the center of the torn cover was a signature. Nikolai Smirnov. And that's where we'll leave our story tonight, my dear friends. The tale of our Soviet-era Spetsnaz Commando has only just begun, and I can promise you this is just the tip of the iceberg. The darkness he's faced so far is nothing compared to what lies ahead. There's a lot more to tell of this tale. Intrigue, danger, and chilling revelations await as we dive deeper into his journey in the episodes to come. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, before I sign off for the evening, I just want to say, well, as always, thank you. Your support, your likes, your comments, and your shares. Those are the fuel that keeps this channel going and allows me to bring you these stories. Now, if you enjoyed tonight's tale, let me know in the comments. What do you think is going to happen next? Remember the old days? The Soviet era? Who or what do you think our commando is really up against? I would love to hear your theories. Now make sure, please, to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. And hey, if you're as hooked as I am, share this with a friend who loves a good mystery. Till next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones rooted in the truth. See you soon, my friends. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.